We are pleased to have Vanessa Abercrombie as our presenter. Vanessa is a GC Applications Chemist at Agilent Technologies in Folsom, California. Vanessa has a broad background in GC and GCMS, including experience as an instrument chemist at Bode Technology in Virginia, working under contract to the FBI's Laboratory Division. Prior to that, Vanessa worked for ETS Labs in St. Helena, California, as an application chemist, where she researched and developed quantitative separations by GCMS and UHPLC for beer, wine, and spirits. She holds a Master's of Forensic Science from the George Washington University and a Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry from Sonoma State University. All right, it gives me great pleasure to turn today's event over to Vanessa Abercrombie. Vanessa, please go ahead.
All right. Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a very nice day. Let me share my screen. All right. So as the summer starts to heat up, some of us are starting to make plans to go out and do things like go to the beach. Well, how do you prepare to have the best time possible? Depending on the high temperature, that would affect what you would bring with you. In addition to a beach towel or an umbrella or water, all of these have to be determined by how hot it's going to be to make sure that you have the best time possible. Preparing for high temperature gas chromatography is just like preparing to go to the beach, because the first question we need to ask is, what is the max temperature we need to go up to? Typically, GC applications don't usually go above 350 degrees, and that's because most applications don't require to go above 350. For the ones that do require heat above 350 and some that need to go above 400 degrees, it's important to consider all the supplies you are working with. Columns have a maximum temperature that's listed on their box, so that's easy to see. But other supplies like septas and ferrules also have a max temperature. And when operating above the norm, it's extremely important to consider the supplies that can handle the heat. Also, what detector are you wanting to use? Some detectors, like FIDs, work great at high temperatures and are designed to handle up to 450 degrees, but other detectors, like mass specs, may end up having unintended problems when operating above 350. High temperature applications don't need to be frustrating. They just need a little bit of preparation. And with a bit of preparing for high temperature applications, we can perform successful high temperature GC without breaking a sweat. Before we go into how to best plan for our high temperature applications, we need to determine if our application warrants the need for a high temperature label. From semi-volatiles to flavors and fragrances to finished petroleum products, for the most part, these applications operate between a norm of 40 degrees to 350 degrees, with occasionally requiring some sub-ambient starting temperatures. It's only for applications like crude oils, polymer additives, and triglycerides that need to go greater than 350 in order to elute all the compounds off the column. These applications are the ones that would be considered high temperature, and extra thought needs to be taken into consideration as to which supplies we need to use. But for all these other applications, which are the vast majority that don't need to go above 350, specially designed high temperature columns aren't really needed. And in fact, you'd be better off selecting a more appropriate ultra inert column for the majority of those applications. So if an applications have a wide range of temperature limits, and if you look at our column catalog, you'll find a plethora of maximum temperatures. How are the maximum temperatures defined? And what makes a DB5 different than a DB5HT? If you think about the parts inside a capillary column, there are two main considerations, the stationary phase and the capillary tubing. Now, when I say capillary tubing, I'm going to be referring to the fused silica and polyamide coated portions at the moment, but we're going to break that down a little bit later. You may have seen temperature limits printed on the column boxes and are aware that a wax phase has a different maximum allowable temperature, often seen as MAOT, than, say, a carboplot column. And this is the temperature limit based on the stationary phase. This is the recommended maximum temperature of the stationary phase to ensure optimum bleed, stability, and inertness. There are other phases, such as PDMS or 5% phenyl, that can be stable at much higher temperatures, but on their box states either a max of 350 for a regular column, 400 degrees for a high temperature fused silica column, and 430 degrees for deactivated stainless steel columns. So why is that? That's because this is the temperature limit that is dependent on the type of tubing that's being used. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this webinar, it's that the maximum temperature of the stationary phase is independent of the maximum temperature of the capillary tubing. And both of these are important when selecting the right column for your application. And it becomes even more important when you start thinking about going above 350. Both the max temperature of the stationary phase and the capillary tubing are critical to your analysis. If you go above the max temperature of the stationary phase, your bleed can increase and the K and retention index of your peaks can start to change. If you go above the max temperature for the capillary tubing, you can start to burn off the polyamide coating, which can cause the column to become brittle or even break. Sure, you might get lucky and the column might be fine if you do this just once, but it might not. And if you continue to go above the recommended maximum allowable temperature, eventually something bad's going to happen. Much like a weightlifter who continually tries to lift too heavy of a weight than they're ready for. They might not hurt themselves the first time, but they could also pull a muscle right away. Or after attempting multiple reps with too heavy of a weight, they will not be able to lift their arms above their head the next day. The point is, the max temperature of a column matters, and it especially matters when you start to go above 350. So it's important to not just know how hot you can go, it's about how hot you need to go and determine the best supplies for your analysis. Maintaining a leak-free system is important for all columns, and anytime you combine oxygen and column phase and heat, bad things are going to happen. And it's especially even more important when you are working with very high temperatures to start off with a leak-free system, in addition to making sure that your column is properly installed. Using gas clean filters are a great way to know if you have a leak before it gets to the GC and protect your column from oxygen and moisture contaminants that may have crept into your gas line. On your gas filter, the blue indicator on top is the oxygen filter. Once the filters reach 0.1 parts per million of oxygen, it will start to go from blue to dark gray. So when you see that nice blue filter starting to turn gray, it would be a good indication that your filter is saturated and it's time to change it. The gas clean filter can be easily mounted onto the back of your GC system, and with the new 8890 GC, we even have an option for a new smart sensor that, when it's connected to your GC, will alert you when it's become saturated. One obvious sign that your column has a leak is an increase in baseline. This column had become brittle and had a little bit of tailing on the peaks, which would indicate some type of active site on the front end of the column. Normal protocol would be to clip about a meter or so from the front of the column and then reinstall it. But because this column had become brittle from being taken above 350 degrees, tiny little microfractures happen even when I took the most care to reinstall this column. After reinstalling the column and looking at the bleed profile, the first injection doesn't look too bad. But as more oxygen is introduced onto the column and the longer it's held at 400 degrees, the more bleed we start to see. And eventually the bleed is greater than 150 picamps, and this would make it very difficult to detect any compounds using this column. If you don't have any leaks and you don't exceed the maximum temperature of the column, hopefully your column will last a long time. We work hard to make sure that both our column stationary phase and fused silica are robust enough to have a good lifetime at what we state the max temperature is for each column. But not everyone is as honest about the maximum temperature of their stationary phase and fused silica as we are. Some people say that their fused silica column can be taken up to 430 degrees, when we only state that the max should be 400. We say this for another number of reasons, but let's focus on what happens to the stationary phase of the column and what happens when it's taken above where it should go and what it starts to look like when it degrades. I'll give you a hint. Column bleed is not the only thing we have to worry about when the stationary phase starts to degrade. Here we have two 5HT columns. Both are 30 meter 0.25 0.1 columns which would be considered a standard for high-resolution columns that are being used for high-temperature applications. Both of these columns use special high-temperature fused silica, but we state that our maximum temperature is recommended at 400 degrees, and the other states that it can go up to 430. So which is true? Both look okay with one injection of test mix, but what happens over time as both of these columns are taken to the maximum temperature for extended periods of time? Because I trust our R&D department who sets the maximum temperature of our DB5HT column, I compared what happened to both of these columns at our stated maximum temperature at 400 degrees Celsius. I injected a test mix, and then after all the compounds had eluted, I ramped the temperature up to 400 degrees and then held it there for 1 hour. I repeated this until both of these columns had operated at 400 degrees for 120 hours. They both look good initially, but let's see what happens. After a few hours of operating at 400 degrees, I started to notice that the brand X 5HT column started to display an increase in the tailing factor of most of the compounds. Strangely enough, the hydrocarbons started to tail, which they don't usually get affected by active sites. And as this column was exposed to the maximum temperature stated by us, 400 degrees, that peak tailing continued to increase, whereas the Agilent J&W DB5HT column continued to have good peak symmetry injection to injection. The peak symmetry is important in chromatography because poor symmetry would make it very hard to identify if a peak is really a peak or if there's something wrong with our injection technique. But column efficiency is also important. So I looked at what happened to the theoretical plates per meter of tridecane for over 120 hours operating at 400 degrees when this test mix was duly injected onto both columns. At the Agilent stated maximum temperature of 400 degrees, the brand X 5HT column starts to degrade after 15 hours operating at 400. After 40 hours operating at 400 degrees Celsius, the efficiency of that column has dropped below 10%. And after operating at 400 degrees for over 100 hours, the brand X 5HT is even below 1% efficiency, whereas the Agilent DB5HT is operating just as well after 120 hours at 400 degrees as it did on the initial injection. And so I know what you want to ask is, they say that their column can go up to 430. What happens? Well, we've already seen what happens at the Agilent stated maximum temperature. Here's what happens when these columns were taken to the brand X stated max temperature of 430 degrees. It degrades faster. Yes, there is a slight decrease in the efficiency of the DB5HT after operating for 5 hours at 430 degrees, but this is 30 degrees above our stated maximum temperature, and it's not nearly as dramatic as what we see with the brand X 5HT column. And I know I get this question a lot did this just happen one time? And I actually repeated this test with multiple column sets and still had the same result each time. So this is not a one-off. It's clear that when we state maximum temperature, we have the data to prove it up, and that our columns are made to last at our maximum temperature. And you can believe that this column, our high temperature columns, when we state that it can go up to a certain max temperature of 400 degrees, that it will last at 400 degrees, barring any unforeseen leaks or crazy matrices injected onto it. And one thing that I noticed when I started to do these applications is I noticed that the peaks and the retention times for the brand X5HT seem to be shifting later. And this seems strange to me because normally when you start to apply heat, peaks will generally start to shift earlier as the phase starts to bleed off the column. This is a normal process as column bleed is a normal phenomenon, and that's what we start to see with the Agilent DB5HT. Apply heat, peaks start to shift a little bit earlier, but that's what you would expect with all columns and especially with high temperature columns. But that's not what we're seeing with the brand X5HT columns. Right around 60 hours of operating at 400 degrees, the K for the tridecane starts to increase dramatically. Remember, this was right around the time where the efficiency dropped below 10%. And after operating at 400 degrees Celsius for 120 hours, the retention time has shifted from just under 10 minutes to 14 minutes. That's a big shift. So what's going on? What's happening inside the column? The best way I can think about to explain this is to think about the compounds going through the column like cars driving down a road. If the road is smooth, then your trip will take the time you expect. Your interaction with stoplights will be routine. Now, apply temperature change like freeze-thaw cycles that happen for spring. Small cracks will start to develop on the road, creating potholes that now you have to spend extra time trying to avoid around on your drive. And the more potholes on your drive, the longer it will take for you to get to your destination. With the Brand X 5HT column, that's exactly what happens. As heat is being applied to the column, or potholes where phase is being degraded are created. And the more potholes that are created, the more untreated fused silica that gets exposed. And untreated fused silica is extremely active and will cause activity for even the most robust hydrocarbons and will cause a dramatic loss of efficiency. This is one of the reasons we always take the time to deactivate our fused silica before stationary phase is applied to the columns. By the time the Brand X 5HT column had operated at 400 degrees for 40 hours, it already had enough potholes to really put a damper in your analysis, whereas the Agilent DB 5HT is still smooth enough to put into cruise control. So if phase that starts to degrade, let's just add more phase and prematurely fill the potholes. Well, in addition to standard film thicknesses not being a good idea for high temperature applications, which I'll get into later, the thicker film Brand X 5HT columns, it will still degrade just like its thinner film cousins. It will just take longer, whereas the Agilent column is still operating just as it did on the first day it was installed. Now that we have established how stationary phase can break down when taken to high temperatures, it's time to talk about the second part of the column that is just as important to consider when working with high temperatures, the tubing. There have been many types of GC tubing over the years, from bulky packed metal tubing that was very rigid to the first glass tubing that allowed for even more internal surface area, more even internal surface area, but were extremely fragile to work with. Glass capillary columns offered a smoother surface and allowed for better polymer coating efficiency, but they were still rigid and had to be handled with care. It wasn't until HP adapted the process for making fiber optic cables, and with the additional layer of silicone rubber and then later polyamide, just after the glass capillary was drawn, made them flexible and much easier to work with. Today's wall-coated open tubular capillary columns have up to 6 layers of polyamic acid solution applied to the fused silica along the drawing path and are then dehydrated to form thin layers of polyamide on top of the glass, making them super easy to work with, but they do have temperature limits. Regular polyamide-coated fused silica columns have a temperature limit of 350 degrees. This is because that temperature of the polyamide will start, or because above this temperature, the polyamide will start to burn and flake off, exposing the delicate fused silica underneath. There is special high temperature fused silica that is also available, but we recommend a maximum temperature of 400 degrees because even though there is more polyamide on the column, polyamide was never intended to go above 400 degrees for long periods of time. And eventually, this column will also become brittle. It may take a long time, but eventually it will happen. That's why we recommend fused silica columns, even high temperature fused silica, not be taken above 400 degrees. For applications that need to go above 400 degrees, deactivated stainless steel tubing is needed. These aren't your grandpa's metal columns. The Agilent Ultimetal and ProSteel are both types of deactivated stainless steel tubing that we offer. And before they take a bath in stationary phase, they get a shower in silanes to provide a smoother and more inert surface before coating. These columns can operate at temperatures as high as 450 degrees and contain the same phases that are used on their fused silica counterparts, making them ideal for extremely high temperature applications. Now, has anyone seen this before? You're doing a bunch of high temperature runs, And a few days later, you open up your column or you open up your oven and are greeted with a completely clear column. You don't want to touch this column. This is the sleeping baby that you don't want to wake up, and it will wake up at the slightest noise and start screaming. One wrong bump or breath will cause it to fracture in a million pieces. This is what happens when a fused silica column is taken above 400 degrees for a very long time. I said this before that the polyamide will start to burn off, and that's exactly what happened here. I took this column up to 430 degrees for 20 hours just to see what happens because I like to test things and break things. But this is yet another reason why not to take a fused silica column above 400 degrees, even a high temperature fused silica column. But just like before, how some columns say that their phase can go up to a certain high temperature, but can't, some fused silica can't even last at their max temperature as well. This brand Y column is also a high temperature 5HT column, and the stated maximum temperature on the box was 400 degrees Celsius. But instead of the phase degrading, after 20 hours operating at 400 degrees, holes in the polyamide started to appear. This could be due to uneven coating, which would cause weak spots where the oxidation of the polyamide would start first. And then after 5 more hours, 25 hours operating at 400 degrees, the polyamide is no more. That's kind of crazy. The brand Y 5HT column was supposedly rated up to 400 degrees, but magically made the polyamide disappear after 25. Well, it didn't actually disappear. I had a lot of black flecks all over my GC oven, which were the flecks of the polyamide. Whereas the Agilent DB5HT column still looks great after 25 hours at 400 degrees and has all of its polyamide right where it belongs, on the column. I even used the Agilent column to go up to 120 hours at 400 degrees, and then I only had to stop because the other column, the brand X column that I was comparing it to previously, broke. Both of these demonstrate that the Agilent high temperature phase and capillary tubing are more robust and a better fit for high temperature applications than both the brand X and brand Y high temperature columns. If you really need to do high temperature, high resolution gas chromatography above 400 degrees, then you will need to switch to deactivated stainless steel tubing like Ultimetal. Our Ultimetal and ProSteel columns use the same stationary phase as the fused silica columns, but with the added advantage of higher max temperature. Looking at these two chromatograms, can you tell which is which? You can't because they have the same stationary phase and same film thickness. Sure, the fused silica column will start off with a better efficiency, but as heat is applied and the column is taken up to 430 degrees, the fused silica will start to lose efficiency as the polyamide is burned off, whereas the Ultimetal column maintains efficiency throughout its extended usage at extremely high temperatures, and the chromatography looks really good to me. Now that we are all in agreement that when you need to go above 400 degrees, the best thing you need to do is switch to a deactivated stainless steel column, we need to go over how to best choose the right column for your application. With gas chromatography, people sometimes think that the best option to get heavy compounds off the column would be to just apply heat. Sure, you can add heat, but depending on how heavy your compound is, if it's made its way onto the column, it will eventually come off. But it could take a very long time and a really high final temperature. There are other things that we can do to help get our compounds off the column that have nothing to do with temperature. For instance, if you look at our method translator tool, there are a few parameters that will pop out. We can increase our column flow, decrease the length of our column, pick a column with a thinner film thickness, or a column with a larger internal diameter. And if we need to analyze heavier compounds, then we should first employ a combination of all these components before turning up the final temperature. And if you don't need to look at the heavy compounds and are only turning up the heat to burn off the gunk, then you may want to look into using backflush with your analysis. Without increasing the heat or changing the diameter of our column, let's take a look at how film thickness and column length have an effect on an isothermal run with test mix compounds. As you can see, by decreasing our film thickness from 0.25 to 0.1 micrometers, we would be able to decrease our runtime from 23 minutes to 12 minutes. And if we want to easily decrease our runtime even more, if we cut that column in half, we can even decrease the flow from 1.7 mils per minute to 1 mil per minute and still elute all of our compounds in less than 8 minutes. We've been able to decrease our runtime from 23 minutes down to 8 minutes, all without making one change to temperature. I know that these are pretty light compounds, but I like to use them as an example of how we can easily see that short, thin film columns are what you need when you want to get compounds out faster. Now, for really heavy compounds like simulated distillation, we will need to go to increase our shorter columns, increase our diameter, and also go up to temperatures greater than 400 degrees. So that means we need a short, thin film, deactivated stainless steel column. Okay, here come the groans. Metal columns have gotten a bad reputation of being difficult to cut and install, but I can assure you that the Agilent ProSteel and Ultimetal columns are not like the metal columns you may have used before. Sure, when trying to cut some glass-infused metal columns, you will have to use more force to barely get a score onto the column. Then, bending it to snap the column can require a lot of effort, and even when it does break, some manufacturers require a second tool to file the tip of the column to remove any jagged edges. Those metal shavings could potentially end up inside the column and create active sites, which would be bad for your chromatography. Plus, since the material is so thick, it was really difficult to install into my multi-mode inlet. I know when I was installing this glass-infused metal column, it reminded me of when I finally put on a pair of jeans after living in my sweats for the past few months. It was kind of tight, but I mean, I made it in. And when it comes to installing an inlet or a column into your MMI, it's very important to make sure that your column length is 12 to 13 millimeters above the ferrule to ensure proper peak shape. And with a thick column like this, it'd be very difficult to make sure that the tip of the column is where it should be. Whereas the Agilent DBHT SimDisc ProSteel column, all you need is one tool. The same ceramic cutting tool I'm sure you have floating all over your lab to easily cut your column. You only need a little bit more pressure than you would use with a fused silica column of that same diameter, and it will easily snap when bent with not much force. And you end up with a nice clean cut. And a clean cut means good chromatography, as you can see with this test mix. All of our peaks are nice and sharp, letting us know that this column is ready to use. Let's take a look at how these two columns compare with a heavy hydrocarbon sample like Polywax 655. For those of you who haven't worked with Polywax standards, these are waxy pellets that are made up of a wide range of alkanes. In both GC columns, all hydrocarbons are detected, but the brand X metal SimDisc column has a significantly higher column bleed than our DBHT SimDisc. The increase in column bleed that is seen with the brand X metal column begins as the oven is increasing above 400 degrees Celsius and continues up to a final bleed of 87 picoamps at 430 degrees. This would make integrating and detecting later eluting hydrocarbons much more difficult. By contrast, the DBHT SimDisc column only has a bleed of 17.3 picoamps at 430 degrees. And if we zoom in on this portion here, we can see a nice, clean baseline separation. And if you're curious about the resolution between C50 and C52, it's 3.36, which is more than baseline separation and makes for a very clean integration. So what about heavier samples? Here are 3 injections overlaid of a Polywax 500, 655, and 1000. With the remarkably low bleed of the DBHT SimDisc column, we can clearly see alkanes ranging from C12 up to C114 and even C116 without the need of background subtraction. And anyone who's worked with alkanes greater than C100 knows how tricky they can be to prepare and analyze. In addition to choosing the right solvent, it's also important to heat the standard to get all of those heavy alkanes into their liquid phase. And even when you transfer the hot sample to your vial, they can cool down very quickly, and even though they are still injected on the column, can increase the baseline as all of those unseen hydrocarbons keep flowing through the column. And it can take even more heat, like needing to go up to 450 to really push those heavy suckers off the column. This brings up an excellent point. Just because you don't see any more peaks in your chromatogram doesn't necessarily mean that your system is clean and ready to go. It's possible that you still have some heavy compounds hanging out, slowly making their way onto the column, or they could be stuck in your liner. And just as much as your column flow, dimensions, and final oven temperature matter, the supplies you use are just as important for your high temperature analysis. For GC applications, there are so many supplies you can pick from, and people inevitably end up having a favorite septa or liner that they always like to use. But these supplies have temperature limits of their own, and when performing high temperature GC applications, it's very important to choose the ones that can stand the heat. Luckily, we have many different options. For septas, I would recommend our BTO, or bleed and temperature optimized septa, that are plasma coated and can operate up to 400 degrees for long periods of time, and even a little bit higher for brief periods of time. When it comes to ferrule selections, there are two options: graphite ferrules and multi-metal flexible metal ferrules. Both of these ferrules have a maximum temperature of up to 450 degrees. I know people like to use the polyamide graphite ferrules, also known as Vespite graphite ferrules, because you can use them with the self-tightening nuts. But those ferrules have a maximum temperature of 350 degrees because, as we've talked about previously, polyamide will start to burn off as it's taken above 350. And when the coating on the ferrules start to flake, it will start to leak, and leaks kill columns. So please use the regular graphite ferrules with standard nuts, or the multi-metal flexible metal ferrules with our capillary flow technology nuts for high temperature application. For liner selection, which is also very important for this applications and we'll get into in just a minute, know that standard liners will be just fine for your analysis. If you're going hot, it's less likely that you're analyzing difficult compounds activity-wise, but more likely high temperature analysis is looking at hydrocarbons, and you could use the ultra inert liners, but you're not going to see as much of a benefit as you would with a standard GCMS application. More important for liner selection and sample introduction is to think about how to best vaporize the sample and get all those heavy compounds onto your column. When it comes to the best vaporization for heavy compounds, the inlet that does the best job is the multimode inlet, also known as MMI, or Programmed Temperature Vaporizing Inlet, also known as PTV. Both of these inlets have the capability to ramp the inlet once the sample is injected independent of the oven. This can allow for larger injection volumes because when you start at a lower temperature, there's less solvent expansion, and this also helps to decrease backflash issues. Backflash is when a solvent expands past the capacity of the liner and it goes the only place it can, towards the septum. Also, with the ability to ramp the temperature of the inlet independent of the oven, the MMI can limit the thermal exposure for thermal liable compounds, which will make their way onto the column first. And then as the temperature is increased, the heavier compounds will also vaporize, making their way onto the column, which will help to limit the thermal discrimination and improve recovery for heavy compounds. To aid even more in sample vaporization, liner selection is important. Since MMI and PTV inlets don't have gold seals and can be very difficult to clean, it's important to stop the non-volatile crud before it gets onto your column or dirtying up your inlet. Liners with glass wool or dimples are some of the best options that you can use to stop the crud. And dimple liners offer even more surface area to aid in vaporization and further help decrease thermal discrimination. And when the proper liner and inlet are used together, we can decrease our detection limits and have better accuracy of our data. We've talked about which columns and supplies work best for high temperature applications and why, but the last thing we need to talk about is which detectors should and should not be used for high temperature applications. There are many things to consider when selecting the right detector for your application, mainly being the type of compound you're looking at and which detector will provide the best sensitivity. Flame ionization detectors are super sensitive for detecting hydrocarbons and are capable of detecting quantities as low as 10 to the negative 13 grams per second, which would be like being able to detect the DNA in one cell of a hummingbird every second. Plus, FIDs can handle very hot temperatures. It could probably even handle temperatures greater than 450 degrees, which is why we recommend them for high temperature applications, because detectors do have temperature limits too. And trying to use a detector above its intended maximum would be like trying to drive a car at 50 miles per hour in first gear. Sure, you can do it, but eventually you'll burn out your clutch. For some reason lately, I've been getting a lot of questions about using mass spec for high temperature analysis. And I always ask the same questions back. What compounds are you looking at? How hot do you need to go? And are you sure you don't want to use FID for that? Yes, the GC oven can go up to 450 degrees, but your mass spec also has limits. And your mass spec is great for detecting a wide range of compounds. And with that increased sensitivity also comes the potential for an increase in the background if you are injecting some really heavy samples, thus canceling out the detection capabilities of the mass spec. Not to mention what can go wrong based on only the temperature limits of the consumables that are used with the mass spec. For instance, at the MSD transfer line, whether you're using a self-tightening nut or a standard brass mass spec nut, the polyamide graphite ferrules are used. And as we've discussed before, these ferrules have a maximum temperature limit of 350 degrees. When taken above 350, they will start to shrink after thermal cycling and the polyamide will start to burn off, both of which will cause leaks in your mass spec. Normally, we would recommend a graphite ferrule for temperatures above 350, but this is a really bad idea for mass spec. Graphite is soft and can compress, and when you add the vacuum of a mass spec, can potentially end up getting sucked into your source, gunking it up, or into the turbo pump, and then you really have a big problem. But say you use a polyamide graphite ferrule and go above 350, what happens to the source? The newer ion sources are capable of going up to 350 degrees Celsius, but if you have a leak in your system, your filament is going to burn out faster, forcing you to have more downtime to vent your source and replace your filament. And what about after the source? Generally, you aren't going to take your quads above 150 degrees, maybe 175 degrees. But going from 350 to even 175 is a huge temperature drop. And that would have me worried about compounds recondensing in my quads. So before you do a high temperature application on a mass spec, ask yourself, do you really need a mass spec? Are you aware of the risks of going above 350? And also, if you're only trying to go hot to bake out your column, have you considered using backflush? And if your analysis doesn't require a mass spec because or if your analysis does require a mass spec because you're analyzing different compounds and want to use a low bleed column, have you thought about using one of our MSUI rated columns instead? Here's what can happen when you use a non-MSUI column on a difficult sample that requires mass spec and it's taken above 350. This is a brand X 5HT column where I analyze with one of our new 8270 standards at a concentration of 5 micrograms per mil over 45 hours operating at 400 degrees. These samples can be very gunky, which is why people want to bake them out and go above 350. But with the brand X 5HT, you won't just lose sensitivity. Like we saw before, the inertness will also begin to suffer as the phase starts to degrade. So not only will you not be able to detect some compounds, but the peak shape will start to suffer as well. Then the QC won't pass, and then you have to do maintenance and downtime to get those compounds back. Whereas the DB5MS ultra-inert column and other MSUI columns have been designed to not only have a low bleed to help enhance the sensitivity of the mass spec, they are also ultra-inert and ideal for difficult compounds. As you can see with the DB5HT, it looks pretty good, but the DB5MSUI column looks even better for difficult compounds like trimethyl phosphate. And when we compare it to The same test mix analyzed on the brand X 5-HT column after it had been operating at 400 degrees for 45 hours. We see significant tailing for almost all the compounds, and the propionic acid is almost undistinguishable. We've already seen how the Agilent 5-HT stationary phase has superior performance and lifetime in comparison with the brand X 5-HT stationary phase. But if you're analyzing difficult compounds on a mass spec, you really want to start off right and use an MS ultra-inert column for the best results, and keep your mass spec under 350 degrees. In summary, you always want to make sure that you are selecting the right column for your application. When it comes to high temperature applications, the Agilent J&W high temperature phase on and our high temperature fused silica are stable enough for extended periods of time, or very stable for extended periods of time at 400 degrees. Yes, our high temperature fused silica columns do have a great lifetime at 400, but if you're going hotter, like say up to 430 or up to 450, then it's time to switch to deactivated stainless steel columns like our Ultimetal or ProSteel columns. They use the same stable phases, but if you're going to operate at temperatures above 400, you need robust tubing that can handle the heat. And unlike other metal columns, Agilent ProSteel and Ultimetal columns are easy to cut and only require one tool to make a clean cut, making them easy to use and ensure a better connection into your inlet and detector. Speaking of connections, your consumables are also important in high temperature applications. Use consumables that can take the heat, like BTO septa or graphite or Ultimetal flexible ferrules, to ensure that you have leak-free connections. And select the right liner for your application. It doesn't have to be an ultra-inert liner, but it does need to be one that can help fight against thermal discrimination. And lastly, we do not recommend mass spec to be used for high temperature applications, for many of the reasons that I've spoke to you about today. There's no truth to that a column labeled high temp will have a longer life than a mass spec column, or that just because someone says their column has a higher max temperature means that it's better than another one. I think we've already shown that some stated maximum temperatures are not always what they appear to be. And at Agilent, when we state a maximum temperature for our column, we stand by it because we've tested it not just for the stationary phase, but also the capillary tubing to ensure robustness and efficiency at that maximum temperature for the column lifetime. But if you do need to use a mass spec for your analysis and aren't going above 350 degrees, a better choice would be to use an Agilent mass spec ultra-inert column. They've already been designed to have low bleed and superior inertness for difficult compounds. To find out more about how to successfully perform high temperature GC applications, you can go and check out our new high temperature gas chromatography brochure at www.agilent.com/chem/high-temp. There you will be able to find a link to the brochure as well as a few technical notes and posters that we went over today and are ready to download at your convenience. And if you have any other further questions in regards to applications and support, feel free to contact us and you'll get to speak with one of our friendly applications engineers at 1-800-227-9770, option 3, and then option 1 for wonderful GC and GCMS column support. All right.
All right. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that wonderful presentation. Great job. So before we move on to our Q&A session, I just want to open up our short polling survey concerning today's presentation. While this poll is optional, we do appreciate you taking the time to answer each question, as it helps us with notifications for future GC webinars. That poll is open on the lower right side of your console. We thank you, excuse me, we thank you for completing the survey. On to the Q&A portion concerning today's presentation. You may ask questions at any time by placing them in the question box located on your WebEx platform. If you would like to ask a question over the phone line, please click the raise hand icon located on the bottom right of your WebEx. I will receive this notification and unmute your line, where you will then be able to ask your question. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions here. The first one reads, is increasing column bleed over time a good way to assess potential column damage?
Yeah, that actually is a good way to see what's happening with your column. All phases will have some amount of bleed. Bleed it's a natural process. What I always suggest is when you're installing your column, and especially into an FID, look at your bleed profile when you're starting off to know where your column sits and stands. Depending on your application and depending on the column, and conditioning time. So once the column is conditioned, so that could be 30 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the phase, your bleed should stabilize at a certain amount. And over time, what you can maybe track is if all of a sudden you think that you have an issue with column bleed, maybe go compare that same bleed profile to what you did initially and see where you're starting off. If all of a sudden you start to see a huge dramatic increase, there could be some oxygen that may have gotten into a line. If it's maybe one slight increase, that would be something it could be maybe gunky samples that you don't quite see that are still kind of in the background that haven't come off the column yet. But it is always a good idea to compare, and if you have a dramatic increase, that could be due to column damage or phase damage.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, next question. So I thought that when you were doing a run, you could increase the temperature above the maximum temperature by 10%, so long as you didn't leave it there, basically a short-term run-up and then cool down. Do you think you could provide some clarification for that?
Yeah, so actually on a lot of our column boxes, we state a isothermal maximum temperature as well as a program max temperature. And so we state these two, and this is where I think you're going at, is the isothermal temperature is what everyone kind of is used to seeing. This is the bigger number, or it might even look like the lower. So on, say, our heavy wax, DB heavy wax column that was released a few years ago, this column can go up to 280 degrees isothermal and then 290 programmed. And we like to actually push this, and we'll put this number on the box. So that isothermal is the temperature that it would be able to last a very long term. I like to do weights or lift weights and whatnot. So one thing I like to think of, that's like your lightweight where you can do this for a very long time. You're not going to hurt yourself. Whereas your programmed is that heavier weight where you're bumping up and you're going to be doing a shorter amount of reps. So I'm not sure, well, I can't speak for other companies, but I know that some places don't put that second temperature on and they assume people would go above that. We like to state and we push to see how far these columns can last at all the various temperatures. So I would advise not going above either of the temperatures that you see on the box. If there's two, that programmed temperature, I would say 10 to 15 minutes at that max temperature tops. If there's only one temperature, that's because that is the temperature we don't want you to go above, or we don't recommend going above.
Okay, wonderful. Next question. For DB5HT, is the lifetime for 400C 120H or
hours? Yeah. You know what? It could go longer. Honestly, I stopped at 120 hours operating at 400 degrees because every column that I had put to go head to head, I was doing dual injections. So I had both installed into 2 MMI inlets and 2 FIDs on the same system. And so I would always have the other column breaking right around that time. So I didn't go past 120 hours. So it could go longer. I didn't develop this one, so I didn't push it as far as our R&D department does. But 120 hours, if you're thinking about that, if you're doing say a 30-minute hold, or most places aren't going to do a 30-minute hold at 400, maybe say even 20 minutes or so. Let me just do math because I haven't had a full cup of coffee yet, so 120 even divide by, so we might get, you can get up to 480, up to 500 injections of samples if you're doing a 15-minute hold or so at the end at your final temperature, which is actually a pretty long lifetime for high temperature analysis. And that's just per the 120 hours operating at 400. It can probably last longer. I just did not have the time to really push further.
Okay, thank you. They also want to know what the lifetime at 280 C.
Oh gosh, I mean, at 280 for a DB5HT column, that would now, I think, more depend on what you're injecting. That phase will be very stable, and so the phase and the fused silica are incredibly stable for the DB5HT for that period of time. So barring oxygen or crazy sample in matrices getting injected a long time. But if you're only going up to 280, I would wonder about your application if you're choosing the right column. Maybe for something that is only going to 280 and you're not having to worry about anything else, then maybe look at an ultra-inert column, or if you're wanting to do mass spec, a mass spec ultra-inert column for that application. Because if you're not going to go above 350, why go for the 5HT? I mean, it's a high temperature application. It's made to go and last for those between the 350, 400 degree range applications.
Perfect. Next question. Can metal columns be used with MS? We do a lot of high temperature GCMS applications.
So I've gotten this question a bit recently, and we don't recommend this. There's a lot of sealing. So one of the things for the mass spec, I mean, going into this, I can hear some of our mass spec team probably screaming from down in Santa Clara that you can have a lot of issues for sealing. Those mass spec, it's a different diameter for the metal columns and for the transfer line. Normally, most of the metal columns, the Pro Steel and whatnot, are going to be megabore, and with those higher flow rates, that's not recommended for mass spec applications because that will actually be detrimental to the ionization of the compounds. For some of the high resolution ones, I have not looked at that, but honestly, if you're looking at high temperature and mass spec, there's a lot of issues going in there because we're going to start using you're going to potentially introduce leaks going into the system because of just the Vespite graphite ferrules going into the mass spec. And I think there might be some other potential shorting issues with the metal column with the source, but I can't remember that one or not. I'll look back on that.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Let's see. Is the max temp for the substrate also listed on the box?
So we really only have one maximum temperature listed, and that is actually taking into account both the phase and the tubing. So normally what you're going to see, it will be more dependent on the phase, the stationary phase itself, because we just have a wider variety. And since most applications usually stay below the 350 mark, most of that number that you're going to see on the box is due to stationary phase. It's only when you get above 350 where that number is more reliant on the type of tubing. So when you're looking at, I'll use the wax comparison. The DB wax UI has a maximum temperature of 250 degrees for isothermal and 260 programmed. That is due to the polyethylene glycol phase of the wax column. Whereas, say, for the 5MS UI could go higher, or the heavy wax, that phase can actually go up to 280 degrees or 290 degrees programmed. This is due to the actual phase inside the tubing itself. So yeah, most of the time it's due to phase temperature or the phase max, not the tubing. But once you approach or go above 350, it's all about the tubing.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I'm trying to develop a method to analyze methanol in water. What column would you recommend for this? I know water injections are tricky.
Yeah, so methanol in water, if you're doing a liquid injection, I would, first of all, make sure that you're using a bonded and cross-linked phase. Those ones, and what you can see is how we have all of on our sites. If you see like DB, or actually most of our columns will state whether they are bonded cross-link. There's a lot of questions I'd have to go back. Most of the phases do not really get affected as much by water. Water is not the bad guy with phase. It's other parts that will go back and destroy it. Especially when things are bonded and cross-linked, you shouldn't have as many issues with aqueous injections. Where you will have an issue is injection volume, because of the expansion volume of water, especially if you're looking at methanol in water. So for that, you'd actually have to start with a smaller injection volume, because if you did a 1 microliter injection of water into even, I think the largest volume of one of our liners is around 900 microliters. So and we have actually a solvent vapor calculator on available on most of our instrumentation software. It'll tell you what the solvent expansion will be for that solvent. So I would really worry about that. Now, depending on separating methanol from water, a wax phase could be a very good option, and also maybe go for an ultra inert wax like a DB Wax UI. Another one that could be good is for residual solvents. A lot of times people are using the DB624 UI. That's another one, but I can touch base with you and see what other needs your application needs.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question, is it possible to bake the column again at temperature of about 220 C for DB-VRX after using it for some time?
See, you have to forgive me. I don't have all the maximum temperatures in my head. We have such a huge catalog. If that is the maximum temperature, it could be. Gosh, I can't remember what that one is right now, and it's going to take me a while to scroll through the column catalog. But you can go, if it is the maximum temperature for any column, you could bake out a little bit more. But I would also think of, why do you need to bake out? Is this just a one-time accidental injection where you're trying to bake out for one sample? Is this something that happens every time? So maybe is more sample prep needed, depending on the compounds you're looking at. So I mean, there's a lot of different factors in there as to why you're needing to bake out. But as long as you're staying at that recommended maximum temperature, you should be okay.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So we are at the top of our hour, so we'll take couple more questions so that we don't go over too much of your time. But if anyone has any other questions, please go ahead and input those now before you log off. I will be sending a list of all of the questions with your contact information over to Vanessa and to Alex. So if you guys have any other ones, we can definitely take those offline. But our next question here, can you use the GC oven to bake out vial cap septas at 150 C?
I would want to know why you're wanting to do that. I would not say no, but I would want to know why you're needing to bake out your vial cap septas. Those are usually, one and done. If you're using the Agilent standard ones, if there's an issue, I wouldn't usually, if you're seeing something where residual or whatnot, I would want to know why. So I wouldn't say no, but I would like to know more information from you on why you're wanting to bake out your vial septas. So yeah, we'll chat. I'll find out more.
Okay, perfect. Our next question, is it okay to set column temperature to 120 degrees Celsius when it is not in testing?
As long as you have flow going through your column, depending on the column, making sure, and I don't believe we have ones that are have a max temperature below 120. Yeah, as long as it's staying in that rate and you have flow going through your column, you should be okay. The important thing is anytime you're going to, say, have your oven on above ambient temperature, you need flow going through that column as well to kind of keeping everything all stable.
Okay, wonderful. Let's go ahead and take one or two more questions. Next question. I've never used stainless steel columns, only the siloxane ones. When is the steel columns a better choice?
So you want to go for the deactivated stainless steel columns anytime your application needs to go above 400 degrees Celsius. Other than that, you're fine with using the regular columns, the regular fused silica columns, either for, if you're below 350, you can stay with the traditional fused silica. If you're going between 350 to 400, that would be when you want to use the high temperature fused silica columns. But anytime over 400, you got to switch to the deactivated stainless steel columns to have the best result.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's take one more question and then we'll start closing out the session. Is it recommended to condition a new column at the max column temperature, and what is the recommended condition time?
Ooh, so all right, so the condition time is going to be slightly different for different phases. And also, I like to take into account my conditioning temperature based on what maximum temperature I'm going to be using that column for. Now, I can tell you how when I'm going to be using it, if I'm going to be approaching the maximum temperature for that column, I will condition that column at that max temperature or whatever max temperature I'm going to be using it at. Now, time can vary. If you're using an FID, you can actually see this. What will happen is when you first ramp up your temperature to that max temperature, or max it up, it will kind of have a sharper increase in bleed, but then it will start to stabilize. Once that bleed level has decreased and is stable, I like to say, I'll look at it for 10 to 15 minutes and that bleed is dropped and it's stable, that's when the column is conditioned. Now, for some, it might take an hour. Some, it might take 2 hours. It really depends on the phase that you're using. And it's important to know kind of what you're working with. I know some people like to do this, like condition a column overnight. And that, I mean, for some, they might be able to handle it, like maybe a 5MS column because that phase is pretty robust. But honestly, no more than 2 to 3 hours. If something's taking longer than 3 hours to condition, I would really want to make sure that there's no leaks in the system to make sure nothing's getting into that column. But yeah, it's phase dependent, and it's also it'll take a different amount of time. You can just go to the max temperature that you're planning on using for that phase.
Okay, wonderful. All right, everyone. So it appears we have reached the conclusion of our event. So please join me in thanking Vanessa Abercrombie for her wonderful presentation. I just want to make a note that this is an ongoing series of GC webinars. You can see our next event listed here. They do run monthly. This is going to be the URL where we post all of the recordings. You can check out and register for next events. And then for certificates of attendance, please request them from my colleague, Andrew Wood. I've got his email address listed there. We've also got our coupon for attending. So along with the recording link and the presentation slides, everyone will be receiving that in an email, usually within 24 to 48 hours. If not by tomorrow, you'll receive it on Monday. I'll include links to register for the next event, and then we'll also include the discount in there as well. And then this is going to be the contact information, which Vanessa showed at the end of her presentation as well. So I'll go ahead and leave this up still in case anyone did not jot that down. But for now, I will go ahead and leave the session open for a few minutes to receive any feedback or additional questions that can be responded to offline, but we are now going to close the audio line. Thank you all once again for attending, and on behalf of Agilent Technologies, we wish you all a great day.